And Paul's sort of addressing this sort of mindset to help kind of us understand what's going on here, because it's sort of very odd, this particular understanding, this particular pattern for the society we find ourselves in. Richard Hayes summarized this worldly pattern of thinking when he writes, "The correlation between piety and celibacy was a common feature of the Hellenistic culture. The physical body belonging to the material world was deprecated and regarded as inferior to the rational soul, a dualism, if you will. The goal of the wise philosopher was to discipline the body by bringing its animal urges under control of reason. In many circles, ascetic wisdom was understood to entail sexual abstinence. Celibacy was seen as a sign of spiritual power because it symbolized freedom from attachment to the crude realm of the material. So you can see here that it's sort of the other pole, the other extreme of what the group in chapter 6 were doing. And the commonality is that in both of these cases, both groups are misunderstanding of who they are and what their ground of their dignity and their worth is, or should be. Paul is pulling out his hair because once again the Corinthians are dividing over things they should not be dividing over. So, moving on, Paul is trying to root this divisive understanding of the sexual relationship, rooted out of the Corinthian body. And far from endorsing this worldly ascetic way of gaining prestige, Paul is teaching the married Christian couples that they are duty-bound to have regular sex. His only exception to this rule is a mutually agreed upon period of abstinence in the case that they be able to pray. That's the concession Paul refers to in verse 6 when he writes, "But I say by way of concession, not of command." He's conceding a period of sexual abstinence to these ascetic Christian couples in Corinth. What he's not doing is begrudgingly saying, all right, you're a married couple so you can have sex. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, all right, I guess as an ascetic couple you can have a period of time where you're not engaged in this relationship, but that's not to be the norm. And once again, sort of counter this sort of anti-women view of Paul, this misogynist view of Paul, he's also making a point in these early verses that this is a mutually agreed upon situation. The husband doesn't own his body, just as the wife doesn't own their body within the marriage relationship. It's mutual. It's not sort of one over the other. It needs to be in concert with one another. So you might say that this sort of interpretation, this understanding of this as concession, helps us understand this part of the passage. But what is Paul doing with all these phrases where he's saying that singleness is preferable to being married? I think we have to understand two things right there. The first thing is Paul is seeing the celibate single life as a true gift from God. We see this in verse 7 when he calls out, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." Now, if you're thinking to yourself, that sounds much more like a curse than a gift, then, as one popular pastor said, you probably don't have the gift. In this, Paul is acknowledging, when he's talking about the celibate single life as a gift, he's acknowledging the real practical benefits of being single. You're free of obligation to another. You can pick up and go as the Spirit leads without worrying about the cost of uprooting family and spouse. All your resources, money, time, etc., are at your disposal to use for devotion to God and as you see is fit. You don't have to take care of another. And this is something that Paul makes really clear in verse 32 and following in this chapter. He says, "But I want you to be free from the concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. His interests are divided." It's not that being married is a bad thing. What Paul is trying to point out is that once you get married, you're signing up for certain things. There's obligations that come with this relationship. And the fact of the matter is, you do not have those obligations as a single person. And that's a good thing. Yet, if we read this as Paul devaluing marriage, this understanding, we'd be reading this passage wrong. The second thing comes into play here, and that is the context in which Paul is writing this. We can see sort of hints of this in verses 26 and the beginning of verse 29. Paul writes, "I think then that this is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is." And again, Paul hints at the context in writing verse 29 when he says, "The time has been shortened." You see, Paul is suggesting that they stay single because he believes Christ's coming is very close at hand. Plus, when he talks about the present distress, it's likely he's referring to something that they're very familiar with, whether it's a widespread famine in the region, or maybe there's persecution going on. Something is very clear that there is stress being put on this group of believers. And such trials may just serve to heighten Paul's belief that Christ's turn is very, very imminent, very close. So since human marriage is an institution of this world, it belongs to the order of this world. This is something that Jesus teaches when he says that we won't be given in marriage and have that sort of human marriage relationship in heaven. Paul is counseling the Corinthian Christians against entering into such relationships. In other words, since this world and its order of things is so close to passing away, it makes sense not to participate in that which is about to go away. Times are changing and marriage will soon be obsolete, at least human marriage. So he's saying, all right, let's focus your energies and save your energies for devotion to God. It's a pragmatic point. One that he's saying that you're wasting energies in sort of seeking after these things instead of enjoying the station where God has you. Because Christ's second coming is so close, people. He's coming really, really soon. As well as there's the pragmatic points of we're under a lot of distress, and it's quite frankly harder on married families and married couples in that period of distress, finding resources and taking care of one another when you see your family suffering, and are really hard to care for them. So in summary, Paul has a very high view of marriage and sex in marriage. He is against sexual abstinence in Christian marriage, except by mutual consent for a limited period of prayer. And this is to address this wrongful acquiescence of the Corinthian Christians to this pattern of worldly thinking, that you gain status and prestige by having control over all your bodily appetites, in this case sexual appetites.